Okay, it is 6 o'clock on my watch, right? And it says that it is time for us to get started. Welcome everybody. This is the Jelly Roll Club. My name is Yvonne. This is lesson 2 of the new Quilters Bootcamp, start to finish. So I see that Nicole is out there and she said she has her instructions ready to go. She wants to know if the rest of you guys are ready. I hope so. Let me show you what we're going through today. Just let me give you a quick rundown of our lesson plan for the day. So today we are working on lesson 2, which includes thread size. That's which threads you need and how to understand, especially 2 different thread sizes for quilting. Also the size of your needle that you need for piecing, because that's what we're going to start working on today, is piecing or strip piecing our blocks. I'm also going to talk about how to measure and cut your pieces. So especially we're going to talk about cutting and cross-cutting. And then the other thing that I'm going to go through with you today is how to read a pattern and how to get started before we have our next lesson. So our next lesson after this one is on August the 13th. I will be going over checking and double checking your 1/4 inch seam. I'm also going to do some of that today because I want you to really understand how to do that and the difference between a scant and a regular 1/4. And so let's get ready. All right, so the first thing that you should have is last week's handout, which is New Quilters Bootcamp. So you should have this. It tells you some basic things. It gives you an image of the quilt that we're going to be working on. And it gives you some information. It says WOF, which is width of fabric. So anytime you see that on a pattern, that means width of fabric. I call it wolf. So most of the time, patterns want you to cut along the wolf or the width of fabric. For this quilt, you're going to need 3 colors, 1, 2, 3. And it says you can use any 3 colors of your choice. This one happens to be patriotic, but you can just do 3 colors of your choice. The lightest in the middle and the 2 darker, the dark and the medium on either side. The complete list for the entire quilt top is here. 3/4 of a yard for the outer border, 1/2 yard for this narrow border that you see here, and then 16 jelly rolls of color 1, 16 jelly rolls of color 2, and 16 jelly rolls of color 3. And a jelly roll is 2.5 inches by width of fabric, or about 40 inches. So that's what we're working with today, is our New Quilters Bootcamp. So you should have that from lesson 1. It also has a second page that has what the block is that we're going to be constructing. This is called a rail fence in some patterns. In this case, we're going to be making it lighter, so it's called a basket weave. And this is the construction diagram, which shows you that each block is going to be 6.5 inches square once it's constructed. That's not the finished size, that's the unfinished size. And that matters on patterns. So let's talk about patterns, right? And what you should expect to find in a pattern. At the very least, most patterns provide you with a complete list. Some patterns just tell you, 3 yards worth of scraps or whatever, but it should provide you with a diagram of what you're doing, a list of supplies for the top. Sometimes they have a list of supplies for the back, but not always. And then it should give you some information about basic block construction or color choices. That's what you should expect in most commercial quilt patterns, but they don't always have that. One thing you're not going to find in patterns is abbreviations. Some of the older quilt books used to have abbreviations, so these are some of the ones you should know. Hi everybody. Is block of the month, also known as a BOM. I love BOMs, right? A fat quarter is an FQ. Fat quarters are a great way for new quilters to get started. Half square triangles is HSC. You see a lot of these are common. Down here at the bottom, you have a lot of fun acronyms. So one of my favorite acronyms is called PIGS, Projects in Grocery Sacks. I have lots of PIGS when I go to the shop. I like to buy everything, put it in a bag, and kind of tie it and put it in my sewing room, because then that fabric is not getting grabbed or used for another project. Wombats are waste of money and batting and time. Hopefully this is not going to be a wombat, so we're going to finish it from start to finish and we're going to get going. So we are going to be working on this quilt. This quilt has 96 blocks and it is a twin size and it is a great quilt of valor. So that's what we're going to get started with today. The other thing that I want you to have is this right here, which was the second handout that I wanted you to have. And there's going to be a handout each time that we meet. So in this handout, I wanted you to understand preparing your fabric for cutting and then pressing your fabric before and starch it before you cut your pieces. This is so important. Grain line. Grain line is the direction that fabric is woven. We talked about that last time. My preference is to cut strips straight of grain, which is parallel to the selvage. It's not always possible when you buy pre-cuts, but that's the ideal. And if you understand grain, it will shrink when you press things that have been cut cross grain. So if you notice from selvage to selvage, when you fold it in half and you cut a jelly roll strip or you buy jelly roll strips, they're often cut with a fold and there's the selvage on the end. So these are the selvage ends, and so these are cut cross grain, which means there's stretch to that. So if I take that in my hand, look at that. There's quite a bit of stretch, and that's because this strip is cut in the cross grain. So just know, see how stretchy that fabric is? Just know that most fabric has a stretch in the direction of the cross grain and the bias, and then has the least amount of stretch when it's straight of grain. Okay? So that was important for you guys to know. So these are like basic quilt terminology that all quilters should have. All right, so did anybody have any questions about what I've shared so far? If you don't have a printer, you can save the PDFs and just look at them on your device. But I'll go over all of these so that in every lesson we have these. And if you have not hit the subscribe button on this channel, please do, because when you subscribe, you get notifications. There's something called the community tab, and I put links and other resources in there. I put photographs. And so when you go to YouTube, it shows you additional stuff, especially if you don't have social media. All right, so let's go over what we have here. So one of the most basic things that you need in terms of quilting is needle and thread. So other than picking your fabric for whatever project, you need needle and thread. Those are the most basic things. And a lot of times new quilters don't know how to read all of these little things that you see on your needles. So I'm going to be showing you all kinds of needles. These are some of the most basic needles that I use, and you're gonna understand why. My favorite needle size to use for piecing is an 80-12. Can you guys see that? 80-12, right? And what that means is it's 80 is the European size and 12 is the American size. So ours are imperial measurements, and then this is metric. And so this is the thickness, right, of the shaft of the needle. Now, another thing that impacts your needle is the eye of the needle, right? The larger the needle, like this one that's 90-14 or even 116, because these are jeans needles, so they're designed to go through big, fat, heavy jeans, is the eye of the needle. So the thickness of the shaft and the eye of the needle. So this has a great, big, huge needle and a thick, thick shaft. And that's why it's a 110. And I rarely use that, but it is a needle that I keep in my sewing room. So 90-14 and 118 or 116 is what I use for quilting. So this is for quilting. You can use a jeans, a top stitch, or a quilting needle. So top stitching needles are very sharp and they're designed to pierce lots of layers. When I piece with batiks, I often use a 80-12, which is a smaller needle, but I use a top stitch needle, and that's so that that needle will pierce cleanly. I change my needle with every project, okay? Every single project, because it ensures that you're piercing or cutting through that fabric rather than just kind of funk, funk, funk. If you haven't changed your needle, please do so. I also like metallic and embroidery needles because they have big eyes and they're very sharp. So a 75-11 or an 80-12 is what I use for piecing, and a 90-14 or a 116 is what I use for quilting. So the bigger the number, the thicker the needle, right? And that's for needles. For thread, the opposite is true, and I told you what I use here. The opposite is true for thread. For thread, the number that's smaller is the thicker thread. And so I'll show you what I mean by that. So these are all my quilting threads I use, and these are Glide. I primarily use these 3 colors for quilting and white. So when I quilt my tops and I put the quilt sandwich together, I mostly use these colors, either black, ivory, white, or gray. I like Signature machine quilting thread, and I like Glide. Those are the 2 things that my machine likes. So these are the only colors that I usually keep. I don't quilt with a bunch of different colors. For quilting thread, the size that I use is a 40 weight. So if you notice on the handout, so for quilting, I use 40 because that is a thicker thread. For piecing or putting my quilt together, I use a 50 weight. And for hand applique, I use a 100 because that 100 weight is ultra fine. So for hand piecing, I use 100 weight silk. For quilting, I use 40 weight quilting thread, and it should say quilting thread, not serger. It should say machine quilting right on there. 100% cotton is my favorite because it sinks into the stitches sink into the threads, into the fabric, and it kind of blends in. So I don't like using polyester. I like machine quilting cotton. And then I use 50 weight for piecing, and that is regular 50 weight thread. I like cotton Gutermann, and so that's my favorite. I also like Aurifil. So I use Aurifil in a cone, and that's what I have on my machine. So that's for threads, right? And so it can get really confusing. And so I put the thread size determines the needle size, right? So if you're using a 50 weight thread, which is a thinner thread, then you can use a smaller needle like a 7511. But if you're using a 40 weight cotton thread, this is much thicker, and so that it doesn't shred on me, I'm going to use a top stitch needle or a jeans needle. So I'm going to be using something that has a much bigger eye like this one, top stitch, so that this, when it goes through the needle of the eye, doesn't shred, okay? The handouts for lesson 1 are found on the website. So let me see if I have any questions. I'm going to put the link for those of you who are new for the boot camp down there in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. And so the handouts are down at the bottom. If you scroll on the website and you scroll down, what you're going to see is something that says supply list link. Under lesson 1, it has an image, and then it says the date was July 23rd. There's a link, and that's the first handout. Then under lesson 2, it's going to have lesson handout 2, and that's what this is. All right, so now that we've gone through the entire handout, let's talk about getting our machine ready to sew and talking about the infamous thing that we do, which is measure and cut. So after you have your pattern and you read it completely, and all patterns are different. I've been collecting patterns for many, many years. I love quilting magazines because they often have diagrams. Not all quilting patterns have diagrams, but a lot of times quilt magazines have a lot of detail. Like this one has an image of the finished quilt. It gives you material and cutting instructions. I always read these a couple of times because sometimes they think I know what they're saying, but I just want to make sure that I understand. There's often a diagram, a finishing guide, and then sometimes quilts will give you a layout. It'll say, you know, assemble the top in this order. And then this one even has a little quilting diagram. They want you to put the alphabet on there. So you can doodle your own design. And so these are the basics of reading a pattern, right? It has a materials list, a cutting guide, a block assembly, finishing, and that's what I always look for. I used to buy a lot of magazines. I don't buy as many as I used to because now I make my own. Always look for these kinds of things. See this quilt here? This quilt, you assemble the entire quilt top, then you slice it into pieces, and then those pieces get reassembled into new sections. so that the quilt, when it finishes, looks like it's set on point. And so make sure that you understand all parts of a pattern before you get started, because you can get yourself in trouble, especially if you're new. I always look for a pattern, all of the entire thing from start to finish. Some of them have a, this one is a block diagram. It shows you which direction to lay the blocks. And some even show you how to press the tops. So some will show you how to press the block, some will show you how to press the top. And so that's what I look for. This is an older pattern I've had for a million years. You can see that. And it has templates. So if your quilt pattern requires templates, it's important to know if they're 100%. This says 100%. Some of them will say 50%. Some of them will say 25%. So know whether you have to blow those templates up before you get started. And then I always print my patterns, if I buy them in PDF, on cardstock, because they last longer, and then I could put them in a notebook. So I keep all my patterns nice and neat, and I keep them handy so that I can figure out what it is that I'm supposed to be doing. And I love magazines, so I have quite a few. So yeah, that's the first thing. Read the pattern. This has like cutting directions. See this one, some of them have multi-page cutting directions. I suggest that you read through the entire cutting directions, especially when it says cut diagonally, subcut, cut twice. That's important. And always test. So if you have a few fat quarters that are scrappy, I use a black and white, sometimes just scrap, and I test that cutting pattern, and I test at least one block so that I know what's going on. And I've been quilting a long time, 35 years, but I still like to do a test block. So, okay, so let's get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I cut and measure. And so in terms of cutting, my favorite ruler to use is this big long one. I cut my yardage with this because it has a lip, and so it catches on the edge of the mat, and then I can run it across the mat. So let me go get my mat. And I can show you what's happening. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to cut the pieces. All right. So we're going to start by learning how to cut our pieces accurately. All right. So in our pattern requires us to cut units that are 2.5 inches wide by width of fabric. And then we have to subcut those units into 6.5 inch pieces because that's what the pattern says. So let me show you. So the original pattern says that each block is 6.5 inches. There's 3 unit A's. So you have 3 unit A's in here. That means these are 2.5 inches wide by 6.5 inches long. Now I could cut every one of my jelly roll pieces into individual pieces, but that's going to take a long time, okay? So one of the things that you can do is you can try to determine if there's any way for you to strip piece. And so today I'm going to start by showing you how to strip piece a unit, and then I'm going to show you how to check that unit, and we're going to talk about the 1/4 inch foot, which is also part of the next lesson, okay? So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to organize your fabric. You always want to use a ruler that is longer or the same length as the fabric that you're cutting. This one is 18.5 inches long, so I often use this to cut jelly roll strips from fat quarters, but I'm going to set that aside because I don't need it. For this particular block, I'm going to be using a 6.5 inch square, and I'm going to use a 2.5 inch ruler that's 12.5 by 2.5. So I'm going to be using these two a lot for this entire quilt. So to get started, the first thing that I do is I go over to my sewing machine and I make sure that I have a 1/4 inch foot, right? And in sewing, you're going to hear 2 terms, scant and true quarter, right? What is a scant and what is a true quarter, right? So most machines, you can purchase what's called a 1/4 inch foot. And this is what's called a 1/4 inch foot on my machine. And so if I measure it from the center of this hole right here out to the edge, that usually measures 1/4 of an inch or 1/4 inch. And so I can take my ruler and I can lay it on there, and I can see that from the edge of this foot to the outer edge, that's 1/4 of an inch, right? And so that is an important step. So if you can buy 1/4 of an inch foot, that's actually one of the best ways to become super accurate. And there's different kinds. I like an open toe. See that one where it says open toe? The reason why I like an open toe foot instead of a closed toe foot like this one is covered up, is because it allows you to really see where you're going when you're piecing. And so my preference for feet for sewing is 1/4 inch. But let's say you don't have that, right? Let's say you don't have an open toe foot so that it lets you see. You can still use a regular foot like this one. This is a zigzag foot. And so the first thing that I did is I wanted to measure where my 1/4 inch was on this one. And so where I measured was to the inside of this groove, right? So that gives me a visual reference. You see that little groove on my foot? I'm going to mark it with a Sharpie so you can see it. So on this particular foot, I'm using a vintage machine, so I cannot adjust the needle position, is that this foot has that much extra above 1/4 of an inch. So that means that when I line up my fabric, I'm going to line it up just to the inside of that line. And the reason that is because I want a scant 1/4 inch. So if you visualize that on your ruler, this is a true 1/4 right there. So when I'm piecing my blocks, I want to piece one thread to the right of that and make it just a thread skinnier, right? The reason I'm making it one thread skinnier is because when I press my fabric to one side, I lose a tiny bit of fabric. And so a scant 1/4 inch is a tiny, tiny bit narrower than a regular true 1/4. And what that does is it makes for very accurate piecing. And let me show you what I mean by that. So first, I'm going to come over to my machine and show you what I've done. I came over here to my machine and I measured, right, the edge of my foot to my needle. So you can just lay your ruler down right there, and you have that 1/4 inch line. So you can drop your needle straight down just like that. And that's how I line it up. I make it nice and square and straight. So if you can see, I'm going to pull that away. See, I've lined that up with the edge of that bed. It's nice and square. And then that lines up right there. And so now I know where this edge is. And on that edge, I've put some tape that marks my 1/4 inch foot. And my tape looks like this. It's made by, it was designed by a lady named, it's from Cluck Cluck Sew. I think her name is Miss Gibson, and it is amazing. And so I lay it on there, and it tells me where to put it, and then I just line it up because it allows me to line up my longer strips along that 1/4 inch seam. The next thing that I did was I tested my 1/4 inch seam by using 2 squares that were 2.5 inches wide. So I took 2 squares that were 2.5 inches wide, and then I'm going to test that seam for accuracy. So before I even start, this is the first thing that I do. So I don't do a thing without that. Once I have this, I can bring it over to my table and I can assess whether or not I'm ready to piece a ton of blocks. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a new quilter get started. They work on a bunch of blocks and then they realize their blocks are off because their needle wasn't in the correct position and they weren't actually sewing with a 1/4 inch. And that can be heartbreaking, okay? So then I have this, right, block, I've stitched it. If you notice, this got kind of off just a hair, and that will happen because the feet on your machine do this. And so whatever piece you put on the bottom tends to shift a little tiny bit, which is why if I'm doing very precise corners, I like to use pins. So you can open that, right? and then I can finger press it with my fingers. So I can actually just push the seam down like this. And I run, this has got a smooth edge, and I just run that across my seam. I'm trying not to stretch it because you can see it can get distorted. And then I want to measure it to see, does it actually measure 4.5? So I can lay my ruler on here and I can see, is this 4.5 inches long? And it should be, right? And where I'm at, it is really close. It's very short by just a hair. And then as soon as I press, that's going to be exactly 4.5 inches. So I'm going to lay this down. I'm going to set my seam. I always set my seam. And then I kind of lay it one side and then I put my iron down. But I don't push back and forth with pressure, because what that does is that distorts your seam. And so you can see that is off just a tiny bit, and that will happen, so don't panic if it does. And then when I lay that down exactly on the edge, it is exactly 4.5 inches. And that's how I know that my 1/4 inch is lined up correctly. If you do that every time you sew, you can end up with a little pile of these, and then you can make what are called leaders and enders. And so I keep these. I save all my scraps and I cut them into 2.5 inch squares. And then when I have enough of these, I make a bonus quilt. And if your 1/4 inch foot is exact, guess what? These haven't even been trimmed. You can see they still have the little teeth, and they will match up perfectly, and they will actually end up exactly the same size if you start with 2.5 inches. So setting your seams means that I am pressing that with my iron so that it shrinks the threads just a tiny bit. It just kind of shrinks it. And what that does is it sets the seam. So when that thread shrinks, then I know when I flip it over and I press it this way, that that seam is not going to stretch on me. And that's what I mean by setting the seam. Okay? And you're going to hear that a lot when you watch quilters, and they're like, first I'm going to set the seam. And that helps to create a block that's nice and flat. And so look at this. This block is super flat. Those lines are very straight. And if you can see from the back, these are seams that are pressed flat and they've been set. And so that's what a block should look like, right? It shouldn't be a big messy disaster. And when you look at your block from the side, it should lay very, very, very flat. Those seams should. Even though there's a bunch of fabric there, there's several layers of fabric. That's what I mean by setting my seams. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our cutting, because you're going to need to cut all of your pieces, but not all of them. So the first thing that you should have done is sorted your fabric into strip sets, right? So I had strip set A, strip set B. All of these right here are my third strip set. My middle ones look like this, and then my other ones were all purple. So I had 3 sets, right? So I had purple, ivories, and then mostly greens. And so the first thing that you want to do is you're going to want to take your strips and cut them in half. So I'm going to take a purple right here. And why am I cutting them in half? Is because it's easier to chain piece when you have a strip that's a half size, right? New quilters want to sew all their pieces in the same direction, but that causes bowing. Remember, this is a stretchy, see, it's a stretchy piece. So I'm going to show you how to sew these together so that they don't stretch like crazy on you. Cut it in half, right? Here's my selvage, so I know that's cross grain and not straight of grain. And then I'm going to cut my other piece at the fold right here in half. And now that I've tested my 1/4 inch, I am ready to sew one of these units. So I'm going to take my 2 selvages. So this is my 2 selvage. I'm going to put them together. And I'm going to start folding up here. I'm going to start sewing at the fold. So I'm going to go over to my machine. I've taken unit A and I'm sewing it to the middle piece, unit B. Okay? And so let me flip it over to the sewing machine so you can see. All right, so let's talk about sewing long strips on a machine. The first thing that's going to happen to you when you're sewing a long strip is you're going to want to handle that with your hands. And so you're going to have to train yourself not to pull with your hands because you really want to. I stick my fingers inside there and I just kind of tickle the two edges so that they're even. And then I'm going to lay that underneath my presser foot, lift up, and I'm going to lay that right before the needle. And then I'm going to let my presser feet do their work. I'm going to tickle it with my thumbs, and I'm going to let it just sew. Why do I do that? Why do I tickle with my thumbs and let it pull? Because what I don't want to do is stretch and distort my pieces. So I'm going to let my machine do its job. So I just tickle it with my two fingers. Don't push or pull. So you shouldn't be pushing and you shouldn't be pulling towards you. And these are all the things that'll give you perfect blocks. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to sew that. I'm lining it up with a 1/4 inch foot. It's going to want to kind of do this to your pieces, so just kind of keep them straight. I call it letting the self-driving car drive itself. And so I just kind of guide it. I stop and I tickle it. And I let this entire thing do its thing. Like I said, I don't push or pull. I let the machine just kind of take it. So you just kind of walk it with your fingers. And that's the hardest thing for a new quilter, is letting the machine do its job. But you have to just let it do its job. All right. Once you get to the very end, you do not break your thread because you're chain piecing. You're just going to take and you're going to do the same thing with the next piece. So you're going to grab it and you're going to do the very same thing to the next piece, right? Is you're going to take another one, and without breaking your threads, you're going to put right sides together. You see that on patterns. It'll say right sides together, so pretty side to pretty side. And you're going to give a couple of taps of your presser foot, and then you're going to start the next piece. And this is called chain piecing. It saves thread and it saves time. And you're going to do the very same thing to all 16 of your blocks. So you're going to do 16 of color that's in the middle, so your color B, and 16 of your color A. So you're going to take 16 strips and you're going to sew them to 16 of this middle color. Okay? So let me come on over here. So once you have your strip, and let me move all this stuff out of the way. So you have color 1, color 2, color 3. I'm going to call that middle one color 2. You can call it A, B, C, it doesn't matter. And you're going to set the seam just like I said earlier. Setting the seam means that you're letting those stitches shrink just a bit. And I'm going to move that because I don't want to destroy my mat. So try not to press on top of your cutting mat. That is destructive to your mat. And I'm going to take my hot iron and I'm going to press all the way down. If you wanted to starch these because you felt like they were too stretchy or they were unraveling, you could starch at this point, but you should not be starching once you start building your blocks. And so if I really wanted to, I could starch at this point, but this has been already pre-washed and pre-starched, so I'm not going to do that. So I set the seam. I try to keep this as straight as possible. And then I'm going to roll it to the dark side. So the dark side faces me. And I'm just going to take my fingers and I'm going to roll that seam back, right? And so you'll see a lot of quilters, they like to kind of roll that seam open. And I just kind of like to finger press it. And that's not hurting anything. What I'm doing is I'm just teaching the fabric which way to go. And so I'm going to take my finger and I'm just going to finger press it a little bit. And now I'm ready to press, right? This first one. It says, how do I sew a straight line? And this is very straight. One of the things that I do, my pro tip, is putting the tape on your sewing machine like this, right? And then using the edge as a visual guide and then looking down here. So when I'm looking down at my piece, I'm not staring at the needle going up and down. I'm actually guiding it this way, and I go slow like this. I just kind of tap my presser foot, and I let my feet do the job. Does that make sense? If you try to go too fast, it will cause your pieces of fabric to drift. And so what I do is I just practice sewing long strips, and that's how I do it. Does that make sense? All right, so now that my piece is very straight, and you can see it doesn't matter if this hangs off, it's very, very straight. So now that I have it and I've set that seam, I'm going to just carefully take my iron and very carefully glide it over and then press that. And what are the things that I do is I use my fingers, and I'm not stretching, I'm just pulling it open ever so slightly with my fingers, and I'm gliding that hot iron across my seam. And I'm just kind of holding it in place, right? And so by pressing carefully and by sewing without rushing, what I get is like super stick straight pieces. So as you can see, this is very straight across. And then this piece should measure 4.5 inches by about 20 inches, right? And so I'm going to measure that. And my goal is to press, not iron, because I'm not ironing a shirt. And then I just push the iron down, and I just kind of let it glide. If you notice, I'm sliding the iron, but I'm not pushing, right? And so what I get when I'm done is a very straight piece that doesn't have a bunch of bows in it, and you can see my seam is nice and straight, right? I'm going to take my mat and I'm going to lay it down, and I'm going to pull this up so you can see what's happening. This should be very straight, and mine is. My seam is pretty flat. And so now I can measure it to check myself to see what I did. And so I'm going to use this, and this should be 4.5 inches. Because if I take a 2.5 inch strip and a 2.5 inch strip, and I subtract 1/4 inch from either side, that gives me a 4.5. So it's not 5, 2.5 plus 2.5 is 5. When I subtract the seam allowance, that should be 4.5 inches wide. And so I'm going to look on my ruler. If I measure from here to here, that should be 4.5 inches. So I'm going to lay it down. And when I measure, I can see that I am just a tiny, tiny bit shy, and that's okay, because that just tells me that I need to check my pressing, and I can see that I have a little bit of a tuck right there. That means I didn't quite get my fabric all the way over. Now what can I do to fix that? I can take and I can repress. And so this is why checking each step of construction is important. And so I didn't get that seam quite pushed all the way over. That just means that I have to come in here, and I'm going to have to take my iron, and then I'm going to have to just kind of pull that open just a hair. And I'm going to have to make sure that that seam is flipped completely to one side. And so checking each stage of construction for accuracy is super important. Because if I'm off here, it's only going to get worse. If I'm off a 1/16 of an inch, and I add another one and I'm off a 1/16 of an inch, and then add another one and I'm off a 1/16 of an inch, all of a sudden when I'm 4 or 5 strips across, I'm off by 1/4 of an inch or more. And if you're doing an entire quilt, you can be off by several inches. So you could be off by 1 or 2 inches, and then trying to get all those blocks to match is going to be a nightmare. So making sure that you're checking every step of construction is important. Okay, so this one is nice and straight, and it measures 4.5 inches. So now I can add the next piece, right? And because I stitched this from open side to selvage, What I'm going to want to do this time is sew from selvage to the opposite side. So I want to sew in the opposite direction. So the color that I need is green because that's my third color. And so I'm going to take one of these strips and I'm going to cut it. So I'm going to cut it at the fold. This is a full strip. And then I'm going to sew in the opposite direction. It's going to be a little bit longer, and that's okay on this side. But I'm going to take and I'm going to lay it right sides together. And then I'm going to sew on this side. I can flip it either way, it doesn't matter. But I'm going to sew from the opposite direction. So last time I sewed this way and ended up on my selvages. This time I'm going to start where I stopped and go the opposite direction. And the reason I do that is so that my strip pieced units are straight and they don't bow. If I sew these both in the same direction, over time my feet will stretch it and you'll end up with a strip set that's not flat and straight and it's actually kind of curving. And you see that sometimes in quilts that are Bargello quilts. If you sew them all in the same direction instead of opposite directions, you can get bowing on your sets. So now I'm going to take this, I'm going to lay it on top, take it over to my machine and sew in the opposite direction. So let me show you. Same thing, this one needed to finish, so I'm going to finish strip piecing this one. Like I said, go slow. And now I'm going to put this new strip on the bottom. And same thing as I did before. I'm going to line it up with these edges and I'm going to let my machine do the work, not my hands, so that I get a nice straight strip set. And I'm going to stick my finger in between. Do you see where my finger is? And I'm going to feel that and I'm going to let it drop so that it lines up. I'm going to use my fingers to kind of tickle it into place. And then it's going to go just like this. And what I do is I kind of tap to get started. I tap my presser foot. I don't hold it down completely. And I make sure that I stop and I adjust that. So I'm sticking my hand under here and I'm keeping my finger underneath there so that the one on the bottom doesn't shift on me. So if you notice, I'm kind of keeping my finger so that this piece doesn't slip around on me. And I'm looking along the edge, not up here. And so what I'm doing by doing this is I'm ensuring that I'm sewing straight and that my pieces are not being stretched. So I'm not pulling or pushing. And I see that all the time. Quilters want to hang on to those pieces instead of letting the machine do the job. Let the machine do the job for you. So let that machine take that in. And once I get to the end, I can finish with one of these little squares. They call them leaders and enders. That saves fabric and that saves thread. Look at that. Because I end up with no little points that have been chewed up by my machine. And so then when I'm done, I can just take the piece that was back here, trim it, and I leave that there. I always store my sewing machine with the needle out because I don't want a needle to bend and this actually I need to turn. So I always store my machine with the needle out. And I switch my machine, my machine needle every project. So this is a brand new needle. Okay? So now that I have my unit, which is what you're going to be sewing before the next session, is I have it now, right? It's folded down. So I'm going to take and I'm going to set that seam, which means I'm pressing it so that it's shrinking. It's taking those threads and it's sinking them into that fabric, and it makes for a straighter and flatter seam. If you notice, it's got a little bit of a wave to it, so that also goes away. And then I'm just going to take and I'm going to open my seam. Like I said, I'm going to make sure that I'm pushing it open Look at that pretty fabric. And I'm going to make sure that I'm going to press it open with my fingers. I'm just going to guide it, right? And then I'm going to push that carefully with my fingers, not too much, and I'm not putting too much pressure with my iron. I'm letting the heat do the work. And that makes for very, very straight seams, just like that. Yes, I have a video that shows you how to use Post-it notes to set a 1/4 inch seam. So if you haven't seen that, it's in the new Quilters series. I have a video that shows you. I like to use Post-it notes on my vintage machines. If you're a new quilter, that is a great way to do it. And there I have it. I have no puckers, which means the fabric's not folded over. And then I have set my seams and pressed my strip all the way down. All right. Now I use my quilty math, kind of like your spidey senses, and I check this. If I have a 2.5 inch strip and I subtract 1/4 from each side, right, that's going to give me 2 inches. So I can lay my ruler, any ruler, in the middle, right? So I'm going to find the 2 inches. So I'm going to go from 2 to 4, and I'm going to lay that on there. And what I should have is a section in the middle that measures exactly 2 inches, right? So from here to here is 2 inches, and this strip looks like it's good because I'm going all the way down, and it looks like my 1/4 inch seam is accurate on both sides, which means this should be a 6.5 inch piece. And I can check it with this ruler, and it looks like it is a 6.5 inch piece. And so this is what I want to do with all of my strip sets. You're going to cut them in half, right? And you're going to sew them first down one side and down the other, and you're going to carefully press them. You're going to sew with the fabric to the dark side. Since these are the dark, your seams are all going to be out, and it doesn't matter because we don't have any seams to match. All right, friends, it is 6:47. This is your homework. So before the very next session of the new Quilters Bootcamp, your job is to take your jelly roll strips. You have 16 of color A, 16 of color B, and 16 of color C, two darks or two mediums and a light, and you're going to sew them into strip sets like this, right? So that means you're going to have 32 strip sets, just like this. If you are ready to do that, then you are ready for lesson 3 of the Quilters Bootcamp. Does anybody have any questions about what we went over and how to prepare for the next segment of this new Quilters Bootcamp sew along? So you're ready, right? You feel confident? Like I said, take your ruler and measure it. And that should be 6.5 inches, and it looks like mine is. And so I'm just going to take a ruler, and I can go all the way down. I could definitely lay that right where that's at, and I can check that from there to there is 2 inches, and that is. And so I know that this is straight and flat and ready for the next step. So I'm going to do that to all of my pieces. All right, friends, if you are ready and confident, you can. This is called strip sewing. And then when we're done strip sewing, then we're going to subcut these. So subcut just means that you've sewn in one direction and you're cutting in the opposite direction, right? So anytime a pattern says to cut then subcut, they just want you to cut it one direction and then chop it up in the opposite direction. So okay, so subcutting is what we're going to do next time. We're going to review our accurate 1/4 inch seam, and then also next time is Pokemon Go. So I'm going to show you how to make blocks that have some trimming. And so we're going to be working on some blocks like this for the Pokemon Go sew along. So that is August the 13th. So that's when we're going to get back together and continue working on this. So finish these, and then next time I'm going to show you how to subcut these units, put together the bigger block with a regular 1/4 inch and I'm going to show you the difference between those two. And we are also going to Pokemon, our Pokemon blocks for those who are working with that with me. So if you are ready for your Pokemon quilt, let me show you what you have to have. For the Pokemon sew along, you need to make sure that you have cut all of your little pokey squares, And these are 3.5 inches, so make sure you cut all your little pokey squares, put them in the basket with all your other pieces that you should have cut. And so that's all you need to have next time is your pokey squares, and I'll show you how to put these together. Okay, friends? It's been wonderful. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up, give it a like. If you are new, I have a lot of free patterns on my website. There's a lot of videos you can watch. And I do have a video where I show you how to set up your machine so that you have a very accurate 1/4 inch foot. And I show you how to do that with Post-it notes. So do that, and we will see each other here next time. I have another live stream next Sunday, but that's for a different sew along. So if you are ready, go ahead and sew your strip sets. They're beautiful and straight. And cut out your Pokemon stuff, and I'll see you guys on, let's see, what's my calendar say? I've got so many things on my calendar. That is August the 13th is our next new Quilters Bootcamp. So twice a month till we finish this baby. All right, everybody, have a wonderful night. I will see you guys here next Sunday. If you want to join me for some other things, you get to watch all my stuff. Behind me is the table runner of the month. It's going to get quilted next. So I did all of the applique, and now I'm ready. I've got lots of things going on. All right, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and I will see you guys next time. Happy sewing, my friends.